Safe as houses. Agoraphobia in the context of social, political, and spatial structures. By Jasmine Bradley, Blake Biles, and Amber Windsor.
Part 1. Agoraphobia. To begin with a more psychiatric approach, agoraphobia is a subset of a general category of panic or anxiety disorders. Agoraphobes avoid being alone outside, using public transport, being in crowds or large spaces where help is not as easily available. In such environments, the sufferer might feel helpless, trapped, or unable to escape, which can then induce panic-like symptoms. These symptoms include rapid heartbeat, shaking, dizziness, derealization, depersonalization, and feeling faint. Agoraphobia can develop out of other phobias, environmental factors, and extreme trauma, varying from bereavement to being attacked or mugged. This person looks for a zone of safety that may only include the home or neighborhood they live in. After such events, the agoraphobic can feel socially humiliated, and this embarrassment of their public distress can feed and trigger future recurring panic attacks and further exacerbate the symptoms of agoraphobia. Books such as The Cultural Sociology of Mental Illness describe the primary pathology of agoraphobia as excessive fear in the absence of actual danger. We seek to probe and critique this individualistic assumption that views agoraphobia as irrational and misplaced, and to further explore the root of such fears and anxieties. Emerging alongside modernity, the term agoraphobia was originally coined as Platzfurcht or Plazafright in German. Dr. Karl Friedrich Otto Westphal in 1871 was the first to give this pathology its name as we know it today, taking the Greek word agora, translating to marketplace, referring to a consideration of space and in its relation to the disorder. From this identification onwards, the term expanded worldwide, mainly recognized in metropolitan centers as a spatial disorder characterized by a phobic inability to walk across wide open urban spaces. Agoraphobia became a reaction to metropolitan growth and to the construction of monumental architectural forms. In spite of this clear consideration of physical spaces during earlier formulations of agoraphobia, it is interesting to see, and vital to point out, that little progress has been made in developing such explorations further. In fact, despite this early recognition of external factors, contemporary approaches and treatments almost entirely disregard the significance of external factors. Like most phobias, agoraphobia is approached and perceived as an individual, somewhat irrational problem. A battle with internal fear that is assumed illogical, atypical, or abnormal. A reaction that the patient needs to overcome. This reaction becomes pathologized, and the cures vary from individual treatment in CBT and exposure therapy to prescribing medication, antidepressants, and tranquilizers. The gov.uk website reported 7.3 million people in the UK to be on antidepressants. This is a major source of revenue for pharmaceutical companies, with profits reaching up to £1 billion annually. Medicalization can also desensitize the patient so that they continue their lives without questioning any possible external factors. Case studies show short-term success through treatment methods such as medication and behavioral therapy, without consideration of the root cause of the patient's agoraphobia. In 1984, a 25-year-old female was diagnosed with agoraphobia. Throughout her 20s, a slight reluctance to shop or drive anywhere manifested into a chronic anxiety. She suffered from panic attacks 2 to 3 times a week and avoided attending school and work. Her agoraphobia was treated with a combination of medication and behavioral therapy. After 7 years of treatment from the initial point of diagnosis, major improvements were showing. However, it was reported that her symptoms always resurfaced in the absence of the medication. And so we must ask ourselves, is this present treatment effective and incorporating of every possible factor, or is the aim of such treatment simply to desensitize the individual to the perceived threat? It is studies like this that should suggest to us that there could be imposing external factors on the individual experiencing agoraphobia. Perhaps if we looked at her situational environment, her personal history, traumatic events linked to the triggering activities and locations, instead of focusing too much on her phobia individually, we should be looking collectively at what consists in her external stimulus. These treatments compel us to pose the existential question: why shouldn't the modern self come to embrace a built environment whose most public of sites are marked by the kind of empty space we are describing here? Is it abnormal to question the external factors that could trigger such phobias? The spaces, structures, or even events that may have induced panic amongst certain people? Placing the onus on the agoraphobic moves the focus away from the wider societal systems at play, perpetuating and protecting the function of such systems, and enabling the momentum of gentrification to continue. It is important to incorporate the idea of hostile environments. Since the 19th century, we have experienced rapid growth within our metropolis. What started out as monumental architecture seemingly developed into a period of architectural gigantomania. We now surrender to the phallic skyscrapers and brutalist masculine buildings that make us feel meager and unimportant. It is important to pick up on this inadequacy we may feel, that it may push us interiorly to our homes where no comparison is made. The modern subject is caught in spatial systems beyond its control. Fear, anxiety, estrangement, and their psychological counterparts, anxiety, neurosis, and phobias, have been intimately linked to the aesthetics of space through the modern period. Considering Vidler's quote, we ask, is it the aesthetics of space which cause such strong reactions, or, more specifically, is it the hidden meanings, purposes, and implications behind them?
Part 2. Hostile Architecture. Imagine a public space like a town square. In the centre, there may be some trees, a garden or a fountain for beautification, and statues to remind us of our community's ideals. Sparsely scattered throughout may be benches and streetlights. Around the periphery are bus stops bringing commuters in and out from the suburbs. The square is framed by high street shops, selling clothing and gadgets. There's a luxurious hotel or corporate building with a sprawling brutalist lobby and bustling cafes with tables spilling out onto the footpath. Taking in these sights, we see a variety of communal spaces, catering for young and old, workers, tourists. We see decades, or in some cases centuries, of design evolution in what city planners and developers might call social space innovation, urban area management, or utility-minded design. What they do not call it, how it is known to concerned citizens and action groups, is defensive design or hostile architecture. The severe terminology represents that which this town square accommodates. Objects and structures, usually in public spaces, which are deliberately designed to be exclusionary to certain people. It's both physical and psychological manipulation intended to only make itself evident to those it targets. So let's take a closer look at our town square and see what we find. Having finished work, we leave the office, exiting through the expansive lobby, clad in marble and stone, minimally furnished and with impressive but cold, brutalist features. As beautiful as it is, we never spend any time here, never have our lunch break down here. There's nowhere to sit, unless you want to perch on the contemporary art scattered around the place. In fact, the only thing that resembles a bench is the sculpture of a bench, upon which a statue of the company's founder sits. Apparently there's another bench sculpture just like this on the far side of the lobby. Upon it sits an elderly couple cast in cold steel, meant to represent the hard-working labourers that built this company up from the ground. We've never seen it. There's no reason to go over that side, since they permanently locked the toilets over there. It strikes us that this lobby is rather unwelcoming, considering that, like a lot of corporate urban sites, the ground floor was designated as a public space, a compromise between developers and the city, in order for the building to be built taller. Leaving the building, we stop and chat to the doorman, a constant presence, probably quite intimidating to the general public, but a lovely chap once you get to know the guy. We chat with him about the weather. It's bitterly cold today, and he complains about the new awning installed by building management. We ask why they would put up something that's just going to get him wet in the rain and snow. He says they say it'll stop the local homeless population from sleeping rough in front of the door overnight. As he's talking, we notice in the alcove behind him a set of spikes rising from the stone floor. It's the first time we've noticed them, but they look a lot older than the awning. We say good evening just as the heavens open and he steps into the doorway out of the rain. We have shopping to do before heading home, so sprinting through the rain we land under the awning of the nearby high street clothing store. Their awning, thankfully, doesn't have a similar partition to let the rain through, but it is quite crowded with a group of youths also seeking shelter in the pink glow of the shopfront lights. They seem anxious, self-conscious, and one recalls a YouTube video they saw that said companies use pink light, which shows up skin imperfections, to ward off antisocial teens. Their friends laugh, say they're being paranoid and they should head off, with another complaining that they've had enough of the annoying high-pitched whine hovering around. As we enter the shop, two things strike us. First is the blast of hot air, a relief from the cold outside. Second is that high-pitched whine, only faint to our ears, but sure to pester younger people more sensitive to higher frequencies. By the time we've done our shopping, we're glad to get out of there. The faint whine has become all we can focus on in the stifling heat, and besides, we now need to find a toilet to use before the long commute home. There are no more public restrooms since the beautiful old ones in the square were closed down and eventually refurbished into a tiny but high-end wine bar. We used to be disgusted at having to pay a few pennies to enter the public restroom, but that pales in comparison to the cost of sitting in the wine bar which replaced it. Needs must be met, so we pop into our favourite little cafe, order a coffee, and unceremoniously shuffle straight past the glum server behind the counter to use the customers-only toilet in the back. Returning to collect our coffee, we comment on the new blue lighting installed in the toilets. "Quite swanky," we offer. "Not really," replies the server. "The boss put those up to deter drug use. The blue light makes it almost impossible to find a vein." Not quite knowing how to follow that up, we make our way out to their outdoor section, sheltered from the rain, with heaters and comfortable seating for paying customers, taking up most of the public footpath out front. Typically, none are left, and we are forced to find a damp perch in the square. Walking through the square, as the bright, humming streetlights begin to illuminate the solemn statues of austere patriarchs of yesteryear, we notice two things. The subtle spikes protruding from their heads, there to prevent birds from fouling these cultural giants, to protect our forefathers from the indignity of avian abuse. We also notice the less subtle, freshly sprayed graffiti on each and every statue, labelling each one things like rapist, slave owner, colonizer, racist scum, and so on. In lieu of graffito spikes, these statues are all paint and sticker proof. This besmirching of our national heroes' reputations won't last long. The two benches in the square are occupied. We dig out a newspaper from a nearby bin, half surprised the bin still exists in a society hyper-conscious of the risk of terrorist attacks, and perch on the edge of the cold stone fountain, using the paper for dry padding. Looking around this square we have sat in so many times, we notice things we've never even registered before. The benches opposite us, for example. the slats and holes that let the cold pass through, the odd angle in the armrests preventing anyone from reclining. The vents, which release hot steam into the air, are blocked off to prevent anyone from having a warm place to sleep. Hell, we've even noticed now even the tree has bird spikes in it. It makes us think back to an article we read in the paper earlier today, the same paper providing a slight comfort in this grim weather. In it, the writer explains how, until a series of societal and personal crises rendered them homeless, these examples of hostile architecture, pervasive in our society, had previously been invisible to him.
Have our cities become better at hiding poverty, or have we become more adept at not seeing it?
When you are designed against, you know it. Other people might not see it, but you will. The message is clear. You are not a member of the public, at least not of the public that is welcome here.
We realise the article may have affected us more than we appreciated. Things normally unseen from our privileged position are coming into focus. How must it feel to be pushed further into the margins of society, made to feel unwelcome in one's own community? The enforcing done by inanimate but ultimately malignant architectural features, so the general public may absolve themselves of the duty or the guilt. Pondering this, we take another sip of coffee before resting it down on the fountain edge, only for it to land on one of those raised metal tabs used to deter skateboarding and topple onto the ground, spilling all over our expensive work shoes. Devastated, we storm across the square to the bus stop to await our ride home. This time we're not even perching. The leaning bars installed in the bus stop are too small and angled to give anyone's buttocks a decent place to rest. We awkwardly lean and shift from foot to foot until our bus arrives. As the bus travels into the suburbs, our eyes glaze over the numerous hoardings plastered with saccharine idioms, obscuring the gutting of neighbourhoods happening behind them. The bus pulls up at a stop beside a bridge, and we catch a glimpse of rough rockery and cages installed to prevent any shelter from being taken under the bridge, just before we pretend to doze off, to avoid giving up our seat for the elderly and disabled passengers climbing on board.
Part 3. An Urban Condition. Although at face value new developments such as the ones we have just seen may appear necessary and a positive step towards improving the housing stock and creating homes for people who need them, they are sadly often the furthest thing from it. What a lot of people don't realise about these developments, hidden behind the hoardings that promise a brighter future and an improved neighbourhood, with community at the centre of it all, is just how often actual communities have been literally torn down and displaced in order to make way for this up-and-coming neighbourhood. A prime example of this is the Oval Quarter, initially conceived as a regeneration project intended to refurbish and improve the pre-existing homes of the Myersfield North Estate, located right in the middle of Brixton and Oval, and to create new community facilities and green open spaces for the residents, some of whom had lived on the estate since it was first built in the 70s. The excitement and enthusiastic anticipation of the residents quickly began to fade when they started to notice shiny new advertisement hoardings going up around the site of the development, announcing, "Oval Quarter, this is where it's at." This is the first the residents had heard of it, and it didn't take much to realise that they were not the intended target audience. To their disbelief, any evidence of the Myersfield North Estate that they had once called home and the community they had built there had been completely eradicated and replaced with this new flash development. The company behind the regeneration project went to extreme lengths to erase any evidence that the site was once a council estate, with websites, promotional films, and advertising even going as far as to try and hide the fact that the site was once close to Brixton. As we can see here from the quotes of the all-white male population in charge of the project, who referred to it as a compelling account of an estate in decline that needed significant investment in order to turn it around, and a community that was a dangerous place to live, a community that was essentially failing. These quotes show the discrimination faced by the residents who believed the estate to be the furthest thing from these fabrications of a dangerous and lacking community. Here we see Myatsfield North resident and chair of the Residents Association, Uzumaka, describing the disbelief of the residents and highlighting how much they valued the pre-existing community. And another quote from a resident, Joseph, who says, "I could go to sleep at night and leave my door open, believe it or not, and people would say, 'You can't do that in Brixton.' They'll come and go, 'You've left it open.' That's the kind of people around here, you know, good people." Here, the chief executive refers to the Oval Quarter as an area of London that is becoming increasingly exciting and interesting, and then of a desire to bring back a sense of community. He says, "If people want to live there, people will want to buy there." Not only utterly dismissive of the vibrant community now being torn down to make way for the development, but a cold admission of what is at the heart of it all. The whole project reeked of gentrification, with advertising material featuring predominantly white, middle-class young professionals. It couldn't have been further from the reality of the diverse and economically poor but culturally rich community that once stood in its place. Not only did this rebranding attempt to attract young, rich, and mostly white professionals and wealthy international investors, but in doing so it excluded and displaced the residents who had been there first. Even if not physically, then mentally and emotionally. Nothing about the development spoke to them. It didn't represent them or the community they had built, and they knew it wasn't intended to. Here we have Uzumaka again, describing the emotional turmoil of being at the centre of the project. She says, "It's traumatic. People don't realise this. They just think, well, you should be grateful, you've got a new home." But it's the psychological and the emotional. It's the spiritual attachment to your property and your memories. For those residents that were able to stay on the estate post-refurbishment, things went from bad to worse. Although marketed as luxury living, the actual construction, especially within the new segregated social housing areas of the estate, had a very tight budget, leading to poor workmanship and dangerously cut corners, which residents would later find to result in leaking roofs and faulty electrical wiring, and homes that were not fit for purpose, not to mention exponentially more expensive than what had been promised. This kind of thing happens all the time, yet we never hear of it. Action groups are set up, and the residents make complaints to the local council and the housing associations. But as history has shown, they're not taken seriously or even listened to until things go horribly wrong. Shortly before 1 a.m. on the 14th of June 2017, a fire broke out in a kitchen on the 4th floor of the 24-storey Grenfell Tower block in North Kensington. Firefighters were called immediately after the fire started and arrived on scene just 5 minutes later. Despite the fast response, it sadly wasn't quick enough to stop the fire from spreading to the building's exterior cladding, a feature of Grenfell's refurbishment, completed just a year prior, that sought to improve the aesthetics of the block for the benefit of the wealthier neighbours in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea. After reaching the cladding, the fire quickly engulfed the rest of the tower, reaching the top storey just 30 minutes after it broke out, and eventually claiming the lives of 72 residents. The charred remains of Grenfell Tower still stand today as a beacon of the profound inequalities of not only the royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea, but of London as a whole. Here seen casting an ominous shadow over the entire community, over homes, schools, and even looming over the funerals and memorials of those lost. The NHS have estimated that 11,000 locals have been psychologically affected by the fire, embodying the collective anxiety and fear of communities like the one that once existed at Grenfell, and the harrowing realisation that they are not safe, welcome, or worthy. The burnt skeleton of Grenfell Tower serves as a constant reminder that is impossible to ignore or forget.
It is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety legislation that they inflict upon their tenants and leaseholders.
These harrowing words came less than a year before the fire. A morbid foreshadowing, they highlight the acute awareness of the residents that nobody is looking out for them, and that nobody will have the time to listen until it's already too late. The residents of Grenfell Tower, as have many others before and since then, voiced their concerns over and over again. They knew they were not safe. The cheap, flammable cladding wasn't the only issue. The tower lacked a building-wide alarm or sprinkler system and had only one single staircase, which in the event of emergency would need to be used by all 129 flats. Grenfell was populated by a diverse, working-class community, many of whom were council tenants, people of colour, migrants, refugees, and Muslims. People who we see living these experiences of precarity time and time again, painfully aware of the deadly risk posed by their own home, a place expected to make people feel safe and secure, something that never would have been tolerated or accepted by their wealthier neighbours in the royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea.
Whose lives are considered valuable? Whose lives are mourned? And whose lives are considered ungrievable?
This quote is from Judith Butler's book, Frames of War, revealing an approach that views the worth and very survival of human beings as hierarchical. When applied to tragedies like Grenfell, it highlights the root of the fear and anxiety faced by those deemed not worthy of access to safe, secure housing, and not worthy of being listened to or protected.
An ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because it has never lived. That is, it has never been counted as a life at all.
The fears and anxieties felt by those who called Grenfell Tower their home are not uncommon amongst the marginalised. People who fit categories of race, class, nationality, religion, and economic and housing statuses societally deemed less than. People whose life is, in Judith Butler's words, deemed ungrievable, and thus less worthy of protection and sustenance. For those living in the shadow of Grenfell, not only the survivors, but the community faced with the sight of Grenfell Tower each day, the residents of homes like Grenfell Tower, families living in buildings with the same cladding, and even those further physically removed, yet systemically and emotionally deeply connected. The tower, and those just like it, are evidence and affirmation of their fears and anxieties, a constant and brutal reminder that they are not safe. Some might refer to such reactions as excessive fear in the absence of actual danger. Some may claim that there is no justification for such strong feelings, especially for those living in homes supposedly deemed structurally secure and safe, absent of real danger, irrational, over the top, and illogical overreaction. It is easy to make judgments for those who have no such experience of this level of precarity and insecurity, those who gladly walk past homeless spikes and intentionally uncomfortable or unusable benches without stopping to consider why those things have been designed in such a way, for those blissfully unaware of such structures as they are so far on the other end of the spectrum to those they are intended for. But for those who are able to painfully identify themselves as such a target, these perceived dangers are very real, and their reactions of fear and anxiety are very normal, completely expected and rational within the context of their lives and their very survival.
Part 4. Conclusion. Consistent with the majority of contemporary approaches to mental health and emotional suffering, agoraphobia is yet another disorder categorized as an individual issue to be addressed, diagnosed, and managed on a micro level, concerning only the individual described as agoraphobic. Through our exploration of the history of agoraphobia, with spatial phobias first appearing in the 1870s, we've seen that remarkably little has changed from its initial conception to the way agoraphobia is viewed today. Treatment may take the form of a prescription for antidepressant or anxiety medication, perhaps a short course of cognitive, behavioral, or exposure therapy. Regardless of the treatment options available, they all have one common aim: to desensitize the patient from the space or structure believed to be provoking their suffering. Such perceptions, applications, and approaches to agoraphobia, seen both within and beyond the medical field, not only isolate the individual experiencing the symptoms, but can contribute to a rising social apartheid, which serves to further isolate not just the individual, but entire communities. When considering the development of disorders such as agoraphobia, it is vital to investigate the context of how they came to be. From a psychosocial perspective, we might say that in making the city, we make ourselves, and vice versa. If we consider the individual and the city, from the symbiotic relationship created by the two, ever feeding off one another, it is any wonder that a city built up to erase the skyline, paranoid flashing lights and waiting sirens, accusatory yet passive-aggressive signs, smile, you're on CCTV, and features of hostile architecture that scream, you're not welcome here, may lead an inhabitant of that environment to feel isolated, unsafe, anxious, and paranoid.
An element to the individual social dichotomy is that, while these pathologies are deemed failures of the individual, the sheer fact that these architectural designs and developmental philosophies exist shows a clear awareness of a social system that fosters this anxiety. And these inanimate objects are created and this intangible pressure is exerted to help to sweep the individual examples of a rotten system under the rug. In our presentation, we've tried to highlight a disconnect. We treat people as failures, but purposefully create things to push them aside to sanitize our public image. Can our society only exist through the marginalization of others? Is hostile architecture a necessary hegemonic feature of the modern city?
Not only that, when these things, spaces, structures, features, etc., have the desired effect to exclude and isolate people, to, like you said, push them aside, to socially cleanse, not only do we blame and ridicule the individual for reacting in this way, but we tell them that they are wrong for it. We pathologize their reactions and their emotions, and we then make it an issue for the individual to overcome on an individual basis. We force them to confront their fears and anxieties head on, insisting this is not normal behaviour and they must get on with it and get over it. The aim is that over time these people become desensitized to these spaces, structures and features, so much so that we hope they will no longer notice them. They will no longer bring attention to them, and will continue to live their lives conforming to the social hierarchy and slotting back into their place within the food chain, further perpetuating the status quo.
When exploring the ways in which structures and spaces provoke and trigger reactions with certain people, psychosocial approaches of recent years have begun to consider the design, features and embodied symbols and suggestions of such sites. However, we suggest a further necessary consideration that goes beyond the aesthetics and resulting ambiance of a building, a consideration which fully encompasses the deep social, political and historical context of how it came to be. When looking at the landscape of the city, at its hostile, defensive architectural features, at flash developments built up to obscure the skyline, hoardings boasting empty promises of community, and at the morbid remains of buildings like Grenfell Tower, it's vital to ask, who put it there? Why did they put it there? What stood there before it? Who's it for? Or who does it target?
Through our investigation of the social conditions of agoraphobia, of hostile architecture, gentrification, or as some like to put it, regeneration, and the devastating tragedies such as Grenfell that occur as a result, it is clear to see one common theme. Whether intentional or not, they all exclude certain individuals and entire groups of people, most of whom are painfully aware that this is the case. In the event of Grenfell, we found it wasn't just the cladding that was to blame, but also the wider societal issues that put it there in the first place. What happened at Grenfell, and what we see in the use of hostile architecture and in the developments and refurbishments aimed to cover up the reality of entire communities living in poverty, are symptoms of the contemporary urban condition, of deep-rooted structural discrimination, of the violence and precarity of neoliberal capitalist society, and a stark reminder of how inequality is built into the urban landscape.